If you grew up believing that Jehovah could hear even your thoughts, then please stay with me. For many years, I truly believed I was living the best life possible. I was a faithful Jehovah's Witness, the wife of an elder, a regular pioneer. I sat in the front rows of the Kingdom Hall. I raised my hand at meetings. I went door to door, preaching under the burning sun of Rio de Janeiro. On the outside, everything looked spiritual, correct, approved. But on the inside, I was suffocating. Every doubt felt like a sin. Every question felt dangerous. So I learned to police my own thoughts. Long before anyone else had to. I carried my Bible, my ministry bag, and an invisible weight of fear. Fear of disappointing Jehovah. Fear of being judged. Fear of losing everyone I loved. Have you ever prayed for clarity and felt only silence? Today, I want to tell you how a woman who believed she had the truth slowly began to lose herself. This is not an attack on faith. It's a confession. A journey from obedience to awakening. From the Kingdom Hall to the freedom of my own mind. Hello, my dear friend. It is so good to have you here, sitting with me in this quiet, safe space where we can finally let the truth breathe. My journey began in the vibrant, sun-drenched streets of Rio de Janeiro, a city full of life and color, but my internal world was shaped by a very different kind of structure. I wasn't born into the truth, as we used to call it. My earliest memories are actually quite different, filled with the traditional sounds and sights of a Catholic home. My father, a man of his own quiet convictions, remained outside the religion throughout his life. However, when I was just 5 years old, my mother encountered the organization. It was as if a veil was suddenly pulled over our household. The colorful statues were replaced by gray magazines, and the spontaneous laughter of our family gatherings was slowly traded for the rigid study of paragraphs and scriptures. As a little girl, I didn't understand the theology, but I felt the shift in my mother's heart. She had found something that promised her the world, but it would eventually cost us the simple, unconditional bond of a family. Growing up in a divided household in Rio was my first lesson in living a double life. On one side, there was my father, who represented the world, a place I was taught to fear, but where I felt a strange sense of normalcy. On the other side was my mother, who was becoming increasingly devoted to the Kingdom Hall. I remember the humidity of the Rio afternoons, sitting on the floor while she studied the Live Forever book with me. I wanted to please her so desperately. In a child's mind, the love of a parent is the same as the love of God. So I learned to say the right words, to point at the pictures of lions and lambs in the paradise, and to ignore the heavy feeling in my chest when my father sat alone in the living room while we prepared for meetings. The organization began to take up more space in our house than we did. It wasn't just a religion, it was a guest that never left, a silent observer at every meal, judging whether we were being spiritual enough. By the age of 8, my identity was already being swallowed by the routine of the congregation. In Rio, where the culture is so social and expressive, being a witness felt like being a ghost in your own neighborhood. While other kids were celebrating birthdays with cake and music, I was taught to look away, to feel a sense of pity for them because they didn't have the truth. I remember the internal conflict of standing in the school hallway during the national anthem, or being the only child who couldn't participate in holiday activities. My mother would tell me that I was being courageous for Jehovah, but inside, I just felt lonely. I began to develop a specialized vocabulary, using terms like bad associations to describe my schoolmates. I was being taught to build walls before I even knew how to build friendships. The Kingdom Hall became my entire social circle, a place where approval was the only currency that mattered, and I was determined to be the wealthiest child in the room. The pressure to progress was a constant, silent hum in the background of my youth. In the organization, you are never just a child, you are a potential publisher, a future pioneer, a tool for the governing body. My mother's status in the congregation was indirectly tied to my behavior. If I was quiet during the 5 hours of meetings every week, she was a good mother. If I raised my hand to give a pre-planned comment, she was spiritually strong. This created a dynamic where my spiritual growth was more about her reputation than my own faith. I remember the long bus rides across Rio to attend assemblies, the scratchy fabric of my modest dresses, and the endless repetition of the same themes. The end is near, the world is wicked, and only those inside the ark of the organization will survive. It was a heavy burden for a young heart to carry, the idea that everyone I saw on the street, the baker, the bus driver, my own father, was destined for destruction unless they joined us. As I approached my preteen years, the field service became a mandatory part of my existence. Walking through the hills of Rio, knocking on the doors of strangers, was an exercise in extreme anxiety. I was a shy girl, but in the organization, shyness is seen as a lack of faith. I had to learn the door-to-door pitch, how to offer the magazines with a practiced smile, and how to handle the rejection of worldly people. There was a specific kind of shame in seeing a schoolmate while I was carrying my witness bag. I would pray to Jehovah to make me invisible, yet at the same time, I felt a twisted sense of pride. I believed I was part of an elite group, the only ones who truly knew the truth about the governing body and the new system. This duality, feeling both inferior and superior, is a hallmark of the JW experience. It keeps you trapped in a cycle of seeking validation from the elders while distancing yourself from the very people you are supposedly trying to save. My father's presence in the house was a constant reminder of what I was missing, and yet he was my only link to reality. He didn't oppose my mother, but he didn't join her either. He stayed in the background, a quiet figure of common sense in a home increasingly dominated by cult-like devotion. I remember watching him and wondering why the Almighty would want to destroy such a kind man just because he didn't attend meetings at the Kingdom Hall. To resolve this cognitive dissonance, I worked even harder to be perfect. I thought that if I were the best possible daughter and the most zealous witness, maybe Jehovah would spare him. This is the weight we put on children in the organization. We make them feel responsible for the eternal lives of their loved ones. Every hour I didn't spend in the ministry felt like a betrayal of my family's future in the paradise. The guilt was a shadow that followed me even in the bright Rio sun. The spiritual food we received was designed to reinforce this guilt and the need for total obedience. We were told that the heart is treacherous, which meant I couldn't even trust my own feelings. If I felt tired or bored during a 3-day convention, it was because I wasn't spiritually minded enough. If I wanted to listen to the popular music of the time in Rio, it was a bad association with the spirit of the world. My mind was being trained to self-censor. I would catch a worldly thought and immediately replace it with a scripture or a song from the kingdom melodies. This internal policing is exhausting, but as a child, you don't realize it's happening. You just think this is what it means to be a friend of God. I was losing the ability to think for myself, trading my intuition for a list of rules that decided everything from the length of my skirt to the thoughts I allowed to linger in my mind. By the time I was 13, the talk of baptism became unavoidable. In the Rio congregations, baptism isn't just a rite of passage, it's a legal contract with a global organization. The elders would ask me, "Heloísa, what is stopping you from dedicated service?" The truth was that I was terrified, but I couldn't say that. I saw the way baptized teenagers were treated. They were given responsibilities, they were allowed to date under strict supervision, of course, and they were seen as safe associates. To remain unbaptized was to be a permanent Bible study, a status that carried a subtle stigma. I wanted to belong. I wanted my mother to look at me with that specific glow of pride that she reserved for the pioneers. I began the process of studying the organized book, sitting with the elders to answer dozens of questions to prove I had enough knowledge. It felt like preparing for a court case where the prize was my own family's acceptance. The day of my baptism finally arrived during a circuit assembly on the outskirts of Rio. The atmosphere was electric with the manufactured joy of thousands of people. I remember the smell of the massive pool and the sight of dozens of us lined up like products on a conveyor belt. The speaker gave a talk about giving up your life for Jehovah, and at 14, I took that literally. When I stood up to answer the 2 questions, my voice was small, but the yes I uttered was a turning point. As I was submerged in the water, I expected to feel a surge of divine spirit, a magical change that would make all my doubts disappear. But as I came up, dripping wet and shivering in the air-conditioned hall, I felt exactly the same. Only now, I was in. I was officially a member, subject to the judicial rules of the organization. I had signed a contract I hadn't even read the fine print for, and the exit doors were now locked behind me. In the months following my baptism, I threw myself into the role of the perfect sister with a desperate intensity. I became a regular pioneer, committing to the 70-hour monthly requirement. I was a young woman in the prime of her life, but my world was limited to the territory maps of the Rio suburbs and the rows of chairs in the Kingdom Hall. I thought I was building a future, but I was actually building a cage. My life was a cycle of meetings, service, and study, with no room for hobbies, higher education, or self-discovery. I was a pioneer, a title that made me royalty in our small social circle, but I was also a prisoner of my own schedule. I walked those streets with a heavy bag and a heart that was starting to feel the first cracks of exhaustion, never imagining that the very organization I was serving would one day turn its back on me. But before that could happen, I would have to navigate the complexities of a theocratic marriage. I thought that getting married to a spiritual man would be the final piece of the puzzle, the thing that would finally bring me the peace I was searching for. I met a brother who seemed to have it all: zeal, status, and the approval of the elders. But as we began our life together in Rio, the paradise I was promised started to look more like a prison, and the secrets behind closed doors were far different from the smiles we wore at the Saleo do Reino. Do you want to know what happens when the perfect JW marriage becomes a struggle for survival? If you have ever felt like you needed to be perfect to be loved, know that you are not alone. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue this conversation and strengthen our support community. As I entered my early 20s in Rio de Janeiro, the pressure to find a spiritual partner became the central theme of my life. In the organization, you don't just fall in love, you look for a resume of theocratic achievements. I met a brother who seemed to be the gold standard of what a young witness should be. He was zealous, well-spoken, and already moving up the ranks toward becoming a ministerial servant. To my young, conditioned mind, he wasn't just a man, he was a ticket to a secure, blessed future. We did everything by the book, supervised dates, no private moments, and constant conversations about our spiritual goals. I convinced myself that the lack of butterflies in my stomach was actually a sign of godly devotion. I thought that by marrying a man who loved the governing body more than anything else, I was building my house on a rock. I didn't realize that I was actually building a life based on a shared commitment to a corporation, rather than a deep, personal connection between two human souls. Our wedding at the Kingdom Hall was a grand event in our local JW community. I wore the white dress, the friends from the congregation filled the seats, and the talk focused heavily on the threefold cord and the wife's role of subjection. In that moment, surrounded by the tropical heat of Rio, I felt a sense of arrival. I was no longer just a pioneer, I was half of a power couple in the truth. We moved into a small apartment, and our lives became a blur of theocratic efficiency. My husband was quickly appointed as an elder, and suddenly, our home wasn't just ours anymore, it was an extension of the congregation. The phone would ring at all hours with shepherding calls and judicial matters. I took pride in being the supportive wife, the one who kept the home perfect and the shirts ironed while he took care of the flock. I was playing the role of the capable wife from Proverbs 31, but I was beginning to feel like a supporting character in my own life. Being an elder's wife brought a new level of scrutiny that I wasn't prepared for. Every move I made, every dress I wore to the assembly, and even the way I kept my kitchen was seen as a reflection of my husband's qualifications. If I showed a hint of tiredness or missed a midweek meeting, it could jeopardize his standing in the eyes of the circuit overseer. This created a silent, suffocating tension in our marriage. We couldn't just be a normal couple who argued or had bad days. We had to be the model family for the congregation to imitate. In Rio's humidity, I often felt like I was wearing a heavy wool coat of expectations. We spent our evenings preparing for the Watchtower study or hosting bad association free gatherings. We were surrounded by people, yet I had never felt more alone. I couldn't share my true feelings with my husband because his primary loyalty was to the organization, and anything I said could be seen as a sign of spiritual weakness. The routine of a regular pioneer and an elder is a recipe for burnout, but in the organization, burnout is often rebranded as sacrificing for the kingdom. I was spending 70 hours a month in field service, often walking the steep streets of Rio's hills under a scorching sun. I would come home exhausted, only to start the spiritual routine for the evening. My husband was often away at the Kingdom Hall for meetings or judicial committees, leaving me with the silence of our home and my growing doubts. I began to notice the disconnect between the loving image we presented at the hall and the cold, administrative reality of how the congregation was run. I saw how disfellowshipped individuals were treated, erased from existence as if they had never been loved. I watched the shunning process from the inside, and a small, terrifying thought began to take root. If I ever stopped performing, would these people treat me the same way? When I found out I was pregnant, I thought the arrival of a child would finally bring the joy and paradise feeling that was missing from my marriage. But the reality of motherhood in the organization brought a new set of guilt triggers. I suffered from postpartum depression, a condition that the elders often met with suggestions of more prayer and more service. I remember sitting in the back room of the Kingdom Hall with my crying infant, feeling like a failure because I couldn't focus on the spiritual food being presented from the platform. The pressure to have a perfectly behaved child at the meetings was immense. I felt judged by the other sisters if my son made a noise during the silent prayers. Instead of being a time of bonding and peace, my early years of motherhood were a frantic struggle to maintain the appearance of a spiritually strong family while I was internally crumbling under the weight of exhaustion and sadness. My husband's devotion to his privileges as an elder often meant that he was a stranger in his own home. He was a shepherd to the congregation, but a distant figure to his wife and child. In our JW world, the organization always comes first, before family, before health, and certainly before emotional needs. I remember one evening in Rio, watching the sunset from our window and realizing that we hadn't had a conversation that wasn't about the new system or congregation business in months. We were like two robots programmed to serve a central computer. The double life I had started as a child had now evolved into a sophisticated performance. I was the smiling pioneer, the respected elder's wife, and the dedicated mother, but inside, I was a hollow shell. I was beginning to realize that the conditional love of the organization wasn't just a doctrine. It was the very air I was breathing, and it was becoming toxic. One of the hardest parts of this period was the loss of my mother. She had spent her entire life waiting for the new system, putting off her dreams and even her health for the sake of the truth. When she passed away, still waiting for the Armageddon that was always just around the corner, something broke inside me. I sat at her funeral in the Kingdom Hall, listening to the standard talk that focused more on the organization's hope than on the woman she actually was. I looked at the grieving faces of their friends and felt a surge of anger. She had given everything to these people, and now she was just another statistic in their reports. Her death planted a seed of urgency in my mind. How much of my own life was I willing to trade for a promise that never seemed to arrive? The clock was ticking, and the Rio sun kept rising and setting on a life that didn't feel like mine. The shepherding calls we made to others started to feel like a hypocrisy I could no longer ignore. I would sit in the living rooms of struggling brothers and sisters, watching my husband use the Bible to tell them why they weren't doing enough. I saw the guilt in their eyes, the same guilt that lived in mine. We were part of a system that demanded everything and gave back nothing but more to-do lists. I started to notice the spiritual food was becoming more about obedience to the governing body and less about the actual teachings of Christ. The emphasis on the organization was everywhere, in the songs, in the prayers, and in the way we were told to view worldly people. I was living in a beautiful city, surrounded by millions of people, yet I was taught to view them all as bad associations destined for destruction. The walls of my cage were getting higher, and the air was getting thinner. I started to develop physical symptoms of the stress I was suppressing. Headaches, chronic fatigue, and a constant sense of dread before every meeting. I would park my car near the Kingdom Hall in Rio, and have to practice deep breathing just to walk through the doors. The pioneer smile was becoming harder to maintain. I felt like an actress who had been on stage for 20 years and had forgotten who she was when the curtains closed. My husband noticed my decline, and instead of offering comfort, he offered spiritual counsel. He was worried about how my weakness would look to the other elders. This was the moment I realized that in our theocratic marriage, there was no room for the real Heloísa. There was only room for the sister who served the interests of the watchtower. The loneliness was no longer a shadow. It was a physical weight that made it hard to get out of bed in the morning. Despite the internal storm, I kept going. I kept preaching, I kept commenting, and I kept supporting my husband's privileges. I was a PMO, physically in, mentally out, long before I knew the term existed. I was trapped by my family ties, my social circle, and the fear of shunning that loomed over every witness. I knew that if I spoke my truth, I would lose everyone I had ever loved. So I stayed. I stayed and I played the part, waiting for a sign, or a way out that didn't involve losing my soul. I didn't know then that a global event was about to happen that would shake the entire world and, in the process, give me the silence I needed to finally hear my own voice. The hamster wheel was about to stop, and for the first time in my life, I would be forced to face the silence. The world was about to change in a way no one expected. As a pandemic began to sweep across the globe, the Kingdom Halls in Rio de Janeiro closed their doors, and the constant noise of the organization finally fell silent. In that stillness, I found something I hadn't possessed since I was 5 years old: the time to think. Do you want to know what happens when a perfect witness is left alone with her own mind and an internet connection? When the news of the global pandemic first reached our congregation in Rio de Janeiro, there was a strange, almost electric sense of excitement among the friends. For decades, we had been conditioned to wait for the Great Tribulation, and many truly believed this was the beginning of the end. However, for me, the closing of the Kingdom Hall doors didn't bring fear. It brought a sudden, overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in my adult life, the hamster wheel of meetings, preparations, and the relentless pressure of the field service came to a grinding halt. The silence that filled my home was deafening at first, but it was also sacred. I no longer had to put on the pioneer smile or defend the governing body to strangers on the street. In the quiet of my living room, away from the watchful eyes of the elders and the constant spiritual food of the organization, I finally had the space to breathe. It was in this forced isolation that I realized how suffocating my life had actually been. The shift to Zoom meetings was supposed to keep our spiritual health intact, but for me, it only highlighted the artificial nature of our community. Seeing the faces of the brothers and sisters on a screen, each one performing their piety from their own living rooms, felt like watching a rehearsed play. I started to notice how repetitive the instructions were, always emphasizing obedience and the need to follow the organization's direction, even if it didn't make sense from a human standpoint. With my camera off and my microphone muted, I felt a strange new power. I was no longer a passive recipient of their doctrines. I began to look at my husband, who was still busy with his elder responsibilities through the computer, and I felt a growing distance between us. The silence of the pandemic was acting like a mirror, showing me that the unity we bragged about was actually a fragile web of shared rituals and social pressure. Without the physical presence of the Kingdom Hall, the spell was beginning to break. With so much extra time on my hands and the field service reduced to writing letters, which I found increasingly difficult to do, I found myself drawn to the one place we were always warned to avoid: the internet. I had been told my whole life that searching for information outside of the Watchtower's official website was a form of spiritual poison prepared by apostates. But the curiosity that had been suppressed for 40 years was now an uncontrollable fire. I remember the first time I typed a question about the organization's history into a search engine. My heart was pounding as if I were committing a crime. I started reading about the 1914 doctrine, the failed predictions of the past, and the deeply disturbing policies regarding the blood issue. Each piece of information felt like a hammer blow to the foundation of my reality. I wasn't reading lies. I was reading the organization's own past words, and they didn't match the truth I had been sold in Rio. The most painful part of this waking up process was realizing the extent of the shunning and the psychological control used to keep us in line. I began to watch videos of other former members, people I had been taught to hate or pity, and I saw my own reflection in their eyes. They weren't mentally diseased as the governing body claimed. They were brave individuals who had survived the same conditional love that I was currently living through. I started to understand the concept of PMO, physically in, mentally out, and I realized that I was now one of them. Every time my husband asked me to join him for a shepherding call over Zoom, I felt a physical sickness in my stomach. I was living a lie more profound than ever before. I was still Heloísa, the respected sister, but inside, the truth had become a pile of ashes. The Rio sun still shone outside my window, but my internal world was in total darkness as I navigated the loss of my entire belief system. As I delved deeper into the history of the governing body, I began to see the patterns of control that had governed my motherhood, my marriage, and my identity. I thought about my mother, who died waiting for a promise that was based on shifting sands. I thought about the bad associations I had missed out on, the friends, the education, and the experiences I had traded for a seat at the Kingdom Hall. The anger was the next stage. I felt a righteous fury for the little girl in Rio who was told she wasn't good enough, and for the woman who had spent her best years chasing a mirage. The pandemic provided a cover for my withdrawal. I started missing meetings, claiming technical issues or fatigue. The elders, including my husband, began to express concern, but their shepherding felt more like an interrogation than a helping hand. They weren't worried about my soul. They were worried about the report and the optics of an elder's wife losing her zeal. One of the hardest doctrines to deconstruct was the blood issue. Growing up in Brazil, we were taught that refusing a blood transfusion was a supreme act of faith. But as I researched the actual medical and biblical arguments, I realized that this policy was a man-made tradition that had cost thousands of lives. The weight of this realization was unbearable. I looked at my own child and realized that, under the organization's influence, I would have been expected to sacrifice his life for a doctrine that was inconsistent and constantly changing. This wasn't godly devotion, it was a dangerous form of control. My trust in the faithful and discreet slave was completely shattered. I saw them now not as God's channel, but as men in an office building in New York, deciding the life and death details of millions of people they would never meet. The fear of Armageddon started to fade, replaced by a much more real fear, the fear of wasting the rest of my life in a lie. The double life I was leading during the lockdown was exhausting. On the surface, I was still the supportive wife of an elder in Rio, but my mind was a battlefield. I would sit through the public talk on Zoom while secretly reading secular books on psychology and cult recovery. I was learning about cognitive dissonance and bite model of authoritarian control. Every term I learned was a key that unlocked another part of my mental cage. I started to see the Kingdom Hall not as a place of worship, but as a center for indoctrination. The music that used to move me now felt manipulative. The prayers felt hollow. I was mourning the loss of my community, while simultaneously feeling the thrill of my own intellect waking up. I was becoming an apostate in their eyes, but for the first time in my life, I was becoming an authentic human being in my own eyes. The tension in my marriage reached a breaking point as the pandemic restrictions began to lift. The organization started pushing for a return to in-person meetings, and the thought of stepping back into that building made me physically ill. My husband was eager to return to the platform, to see the friends, and to restore our family's spiritual standing. He couldn't understand why I was dragging my feet. To him, my hesitation was a sign of worldly influence or a lack of prayer. We had our first real arguments, not about household chores, but about the very foundation of our lives. I tried to share some of my doubts with him, but he immediately shut down, citing the need to wait on Jehovah. It was then I realized that his love was, indeed, conditional. He loved the sister Heloísa, who served the organization, but he didn't know how to love the woman who questioned it. The transition from the isolation of the pandemic back to the physical world was the most terrifying moment of my entire life. In Rio de Janeiro, life began to return to its rhythmic, noisy pace, and with it came the heavy expectation for all the friends to return to the Kingdom Hall. I remember sitting in my room, looking at the clothes I used to wear for meetings, the modest skirts and the professional blouses, and they felt like a costume for a person who no longer existed. My husband was already dressed, his Bible in hand, waiting for me with a look that was part hope and part command. He believed that once I stepped back into that hall, the spiritual food and the bad association with the internet would fade away. But he didn't realize that my mind had already crossed a bridge that had been burned behind me. I had spent months deconstructing every brick of the organization's wall, and I knew that if I walked through those doors again, I would be betraying the only truth I had ever truly found, my own integrity. The conversation that followed was not the one I had planned, but it was the one that had to happen. I told him, with a voice that shook but did not break, that I was not going back. I told him that I could no longer support the governing body or a system that demanded I ignore my own conscience. The look in his eyes was something I will never forget. It was the look of a man seeing a stranger. To him, I wasn't his wife Heloísa anymore. I was a spiritual weakness to be corrected, or worse, an apostate to be feared. The conditional love we had built our life upon was stripped away in an instant. There were no more soft words, only the cold, hard directives of the organized book. He told me that my decision would have consequences, not just for our marriage, but for my entire social existence. In that moment, the apartment in Rio felt smaller than it ever had, and I realized that to save my life, I was going to have to lose everything I had ever known. The aftermath of my decision was like a slow-motion car crash. In the organization, there is no such thing as a quiet exit. Word spread through the congregation like wildfire. The shepherding calls began, not out of genuine love, but as a form of spiritual policing. Elders I had known for decades, men who had eaten at my table, now spoke to me with a clinical detachment. They used the scriptures like weapons, trying to guilt me back into the fold by mentioning my mother's memory or my son's future in the new system. But their words had lost their power. Once you see the man behind the curtain, you can never unsee him. I saw them for what they were, frightened men protecting a corporate structure. I refused to attend a judicial committee, knowing that I didn't recognize their authority to judge my heart. By refusing to play their game, I was taking back the power they had held over me since I was 5 years old. The shunning began almost immediately. It is a psychological torture that is hard to describe to those who haven't lived it. People I had spent every day with for 30 years would see me at the supermarket in Rio and turn their heads as if I were a ghost. My phone, which used to buzz constantly with messages from the friends, became a silent brick. This is the organization's most effective tool, the threat of total social death. They want you to believe that without them, you are nothing and nobody. I spent many nights crying on my balcony, watching the lights of the city and feeling like the loneliest person in Brazil. But even in that deep pain, there was a spark of something new. For the first time, my thoughts were my own. I wasn't checking my watchtower to see how I should feel. I was just feeling. I was mourning a community that was never really mine, but I was also celebrating a freedom that finally was. As the legalities of my separation and my departure from the religion progressed, I had to face the reality of my double life coming to an end. I moved into a small space of my own, a place where I could finally surround myself with things that I loved, not just things that were spiritually acceptable. I started to reconnect with my father's side of the family, the worldly people I had been taught to avoid. I found that they didn't judge me. They welcomed me with an unconditional warmth that I had never experienced at the Kingdom Hall. They didn't care about my field service hours or my spiritual standing, they just cared about me. This was the greatest irony. The wicked world was showing me more Christ-like love than the truth ever had. I began to deconstruct the fear of Armageddon that had been programmed into my brain, replacing it with a deep appreciation for the present moment. One of the most healing parts of my journey was finding the courage to share my story. I realized that my voice, which had been silenced for so long as an elder's wife, was actually my greatest asset. I started to write, to record, and to connect with others who were waking up just like I did. Every time I spoke about the blood issue, the 1914 doctrine, or the trauma of shunning, I felt another weight lift off my shoulders. I was no longer a victim of the organization. I was a witness to its true nature. In Rio, a city known for its carnival and its freedom of expression, I was finally participating in the dance of life. I wasn't a pioneer for a corporation anymore. I was a pioneer for my own soul. I was learning that life isn't a series of paragraphs to be studied, but a series of experiences to be lived, felt, and shared. My relationship with my son became my primary focus. I had to explain to him why our world had changed, why we didn't go to the Saleo do Reino anymore, and why some people wouldn't speak to us. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I wanted him to grow up in a world of conditional love no longer. I wanted him to know that my love for him was not tied to his obedience to a group of men in New York. We started new traditions in Rio, birthdays, holidays, and simple weekends where we just enjoyed being alive without the shadow of a shepherding call hanging over us. Watching him breathe freely, without the guilt I had carried as a child, was the ultimate confirmation that I had made the right choice. I was breaking the cycle of generational trauma, and that was the most sacred work I had ever performed. The process of psychological recovery is not a straight line. There are days when the old guilt tries to creep back in, triggered by a song or a certain phrase. But now, I have the tools to fight it. I have learned about religious trauma syndrome and the way high-control groups warp the human mind. I have replaced spiritual food with actual knowledge, science, philosophy, and the diverse perspectives of humanity. I look back at my time in The Truth with a mix of sadness and clarity. I see the billions of hours wasted, the families torn apart, and the dreams deferred. But I also see the strength I gained by surviving it. I am not mentally diseased, I am incredibly resilient. I am a woman who lost everything to find herself, and I wouldn't trade this hard-won peace for all the paradise promises in the world. Today, my life in Rio de Janeiro is full of authentic connections. I have friends who know the real Heloísa, the one who loves music, the one who asks difficult questions, the one who isn't afraid to be imperfect. I don't miss the Kingdom Hall. I don't miss the governing body's constant demands. I have found my own spirituality in the beauty of a sunset, the laughter of my child, and the solidarity of the XJW community. We are a global family of survivors, a testament to the fact that the human spirit cannot be caged forever. My awakening wasn't just about leaving a religion, it was about entering my own life. I am no longer waiting for a new system to begin living. I am living right now, in the only world that truly matters. As I look at you now, my friend, I want you to know that there is hope. If you are sitting where I was, trapped by fear, paralyzed by the thought of losing your family, and feeling like you are drowning in a double life, please hear me. The water is cold and the crossing is difficult, but the shore on the other side is more beautiful than anything you have been promised. You are not an apostate, you are a seeker of truth. You are not worldly, you are human. My story doesn't end with Armageddon, it ends with a beginning. I am Heloísa. I live in the marvelous city of Rio de Janeiro, and for the first time in 40 years, I am finally, truly free. Thank you for walking this path with me. Your journey is just beginning, and I am right here with you. True freedom isn't the absence of struggle, but the presence of choice. I chose myself, I chose my son, and I chose to live in reality. It was the most difficult decision I ever made, and it was the best one. If you are ready to take your first step toward freedom, or if you just need to know that someone understands your pain, please subscribe to this channel. Join our community where we celebrate the courage to wake up and support each other through the journey of healing. Your voice matters, and you are never alone. Click the link in the description to find more resources and my book to help you through your own crossing. After the official break from the organization in the heart of Rio de Janeiro, I entered a phase that I can only describe as a second childhood, but this time, I was the one holding the reins. The silence of the phone and the absence of their friends was initially heavy, but it soon transformed into a canvas of infinite possibilities. I started to explore the city I had lived in for decades, but never truly seen through eyes that weren't searching for potential Bible studies. I remember walking along the beach, watching the waves, and realizing that for 40 years, I had viewed the beauty of the world as a temporary distraction or a trap. Now, the sand under my feet wasn't worldly, it was just sand. The people laughing around me weren't doomed, they were just people living their lives. This shift in perspective was the first real step in my reconstruction. I had to unlearn the habit of judging everyone and everything through the lens of a Watchtower paragraph. I was finally learning to see the world in high definition, with all its messy, unscripted, and beautiful complexity. One of the most profound challenges in my new life was reclaiming my intellectual autonomy. For years, my spiritual food had been pre-chewed and spoon-fed to me by the governing body, leaving my critical thinking skills atrophied. I began to dive into books that were once forbidden. I read about philosophy, evolution, and the history of religions with a hunger that was almost insatiable. I wanted to know how the world actually worked, not just the sanitized version presented in the New World Translation. Every new fact I learned felt like a victory over the darkness of indoctrination. I realized that the truth was actually a very small, narrow box, and I had finally stepped outside into the vastness of human knowledge. I wasn't afraid of Satan's influence anymore. I was fascinated by the diversity of human thought. I began to understand that having questions without answers was far more honest than having answers that you weren't allowed to question. In Rio, the culture is deeply rooted in celebration, and for the first time, I allowed myself to participate. Celebrating my first birthday was an experience filled with a strange mix of guilt and pure, childlike joy. To the organization, a birthday is an act of self-idolatry, but to me, it was an affirmation of my existence. Having a cake, blowing out candles, and hearing friends sing to me felt like a defiance of the shunning I was experiencing. They wanted me to feel like I was dead to them, but here I was, more alive than ever. These celebrations weren't about wickedness, they were about honoring the gift of life and the connections we make with others. I realized that the organization steals these milestones to keep you focused only on their new system, making you forget to value the system you are actually living in right now. I was finally claiming my place in the timeline of my own life. The emotional healing required me to confront the deep-seated guilt that had been programmed into my subconscious. Even after I logically knew the organization was wrong, my body would sometimes react with anxiety when I heard a kingdom melody or saw a witness cart in a public square. I had to learn about the bite model of control to understand that these weren't demons or Jehovah's displeasure, but rather a biological response to years of high-control grooming. I sought professional therapy with someone who understood religious trauma, and for the first time, I felt truly shepherded. My therapist didn't use scriptures to silence my pain. They gave me tools to process the betrayal and the loss. I learned that my double life had been a survival mechanism, and I began to forgive the woman who had stayed for so long. I was no longer a broken sister. I was a resilient survivor in the middle of a profound transformation. As I built my new life in Rio, I discovered that my voice had a purpose I never could have imagined while sitting in the Saleo do Reno. I started to connect with a global community of POMO physically out, mentally out individuals. We shared our stories, our traumas, and our triumphs. I realized that my experience as an elder's wife gave me a unique perspective on the internal workings of the organization. I started to speak out against the shunning policy, not out of hatred, but out of a desire to see people treated with basic human dignity. My preaching had changed. Instead of offering a paradise after death, I was offering a path to freedom during life. The letters I wrote now weren't to strangers to recruit them, but to fellow survivors to remind them that they were not alone. My service was finally rooted in genuine empathy rather than a requirement on a report card. My relationship with my son continued to be the lighthouse that guided me through the fog of my transition. We began to explore the world together without the fear of bad associations. I watched him develop his own interests, his own personality, and his own circle of friends, free from the crushing weight of theocratic expectations. We talked openly about why we left, and I encouraged him to ask the questions I was never allowed to ask. I wanted him to trust his own heart, the very thing I was told was treacherous. Seeing him grow up with a sense of self-worth that wasn't tied to his privileges in a congregation was my greatest reward. I realized that by leaving, I hadn't just saved myself, I had saved his future. We were building a home based on unconditional love, where he could fail, succeed, and change his mind without the fear of losing his mother's affection. The financial and social reconstruction was a slow process. After decades of prioritizing kingdom interests over education and career, I had to find my footing in the professional world of Rio. But the same work ethic that made me a successful pioneer now served me in my career. I found that I was capable, intelligent, and hardworking. I didn't need a governing body to tell me how to manage my time or my resources. I started to find satisfaction in my accomplishments, knowing they were the result of my own efforts. The worldly colleagues I worked with were not the drug addicts or depraved people the Watchtower had described. They were kind, supportive, and often more ethical than the brothers I had known in judicial committees. I was finally learning that goodness is a human trait, not a religious franchise. I also had to navigate the complex reality of shunning within my own extended family. While my father's side was supportive, those still in the truth remained a painful void. Every time a family milestone passed without a word from them, the sting of conditional love returned. But I learned to set boundaries for my own mental health. I stopped waiting for their approval and started building a chosen family. This is a common experience for those of us who leave. We find mothers, fathers, and siblings and the friends who stand by us when our biological families walk away. In the vibrant, social atmosphere of Rio, I found a community of people who loved me for who I was, not for what I believed. This chosen family became the safety net that allowed me to finally take the leap into my true self. Looking back at my journey from that little 5-year-old girl in a newly converted home to the woman I am today, I see a narrative of incredible survival. I survived the fear of Armageddon, the blood issue scares, the exhaustion of pioneering, and the isolation of shunning. I am no longer defined by what I am not a witness, not an elder's wife, not a pioneer. I am defined by who I am. I am a woman who loves deeply, thinks critically, and lives authentically in one of the most beautiful cities on earth. My story is no longer a tragedy about a lost soul, it is a triumph about a soul found. The paradise I was promised was a desert, but the life I have built is an oasis. My dear friend, as we reach the end of this part of my story, I want you to look in the mirror and see the strength that I see in you. If you are still in the process of waking up, or if you have recently walked away, know that the pain you feel is the pain of growth. You are shedding a skin that no longer fits you. The world is big, and yes, it can be scary, but it is also full of grace, knowledge, and genuine love. My journey from the Kingdom Hall to the real world was the hardest thing I ever did, and I would do it 1,000 times over just to feel the peace I feel right now. You are the author of your own story from here on out. Write it with courage, write it with honesty, and most importantly, write it for yourself. The new system is right here, in every breath you take as a free person. I used to tell people that the truth would set them free, but I had it backwards. Leaving their truth was what finally gave me my freedom. My life didn't end when I left the organization, it truly began. As I look back at my decades in the organization from my home in Rio de Janeiro, I realized that the greatest tragedy wasn't just the time lost, but the theft of my own identity. For 40 years, I was a mosaic of expectations, a collection of approved behaviors, and a voice that only repeated the echoes of others. Rebuilding myself required me to go back to that 5-year-old girl and tell her that her curiosity was a gift, not a sin. I had to learn that my worth as a woman was not measured by how many field service hours I reported or how submissive I was to an elder husband. Today, when I walk through the streets of Rio, I no longer feel like a stranger in my own city. I feel like a part of the human tapestry. I am a mother, a friend, a professional, and a thinker. Most importantly, I am free to change my mind, to admit I don't know the answers, and to embrace the beautiful uncertainty of being alive. This is the legacy of my awakening, the birth of a woman who finally belongs to herself. The process of waking up taught me that the organization relies on a specific kind of spiritual amnesia. They want you to forget the failed predictions of the past and ignore the inconsistencies of the present. But once your memory is restored, you become dangerous to their structure. I spent years trying to fit into a mold that was too small for my spirit, and the resulting cracks were what eventually let the light in. My journey from the Kingdom Hall to the real world was a journey from a manufactured paradise to an authentic reality. I've learned that the truth isn't a destination or a group of men in New York, it's the alignment of your outside life with your inside voice. In Rio, under the shadow of Christ the Redeemer, I found a different kind of redemption, one that didn't require me to sacrifice my integrity or my family. I am no longer a publisher of a brand, I am a storyteller of a survivor's truth. The fear of Armageddon was the hardest chain to break, as it was forged in my childhood. For years, every storm over Rio or every piece of bad news on the television would trigger a physical reaction of dread. But as I educated myself on the psychology of fear-based control, I realized that this end-of-the-world narrative is a tool used to keep people in a state of perpetual urgency and obedience. Today, I look at the future not with terror but with hope. I don't want a new system that requires the destruction of billions of people to be happy. I want to work toward a better world right here, right now, through kindness, education, and genuine human connection. The paradise I once preached about was a sterile, controlled environment, but the world I live in now is vibrant, diverse, and full of the messy beauty of real life. I have traded a fairy tale for the truth, and it was the best bargain I ever made. My relationship with my son is the living proof that the cycle of indoctrination can be broken. Seeing him navigate his life in Rio with a sense of wonder instead of a sense of judgment is my greatest achievement. He doesn't have to worry about bad associations or whether his hobbies are spiritually acceptable. He is free to explore his potential without the threat of shunning if he fails to meet a corporate standard. I have given him the one thing the organization could never provide: unconditional love. I want him to know that even if we disagree, even if he makes mistakes, my door and my heart will always be open. This is the opposite of the conditional love we experienced in the congregation. We are building a family foundation that is rooted in honesty and mutual respect, ensuring that the shadows of the Kingdom Hall do not darken his future. I have also learned to appreciate the worldly people I was once taught to fear. In the professional and social circles of Rio, I have found people of incredible integrity, compassion, and wisdom. They didn't need a governing body to tell them to be kind. They were kind because it was part of their humanity. I have found brothers and sisters in the most unexpected places, in my neighbors, my colleagues, and other survivors of high control groups. These connections are deep and real because they aren't based on a shared checklist of doctrines, but on a shared experience of life. I no longer view the world as a wicked place to be escaped, but as a community to be embraced. I have found that the more I trust myself and others, the more the world opens up to me in ways I never thought possible during my years as a pioneer. The financial and social toll of leaving was significant, as the organization is designed to make departure as difficult as possible. I had to rebuild my career in Rio later in life than most, having spent my youth chasing a paradise that never came. But the resilience I developed as a regular pioneer proved to be a hidden asset. I learned to be disciplined, to communicate, and to persist in the face of rejection. These theocratic skills, once used to build a corporation, were now being used to build my own security. I am proud of the independent woman I have become. I am no longer dependent on a husband's privileges for my status or a congregation's approval for my self-esteem. I earn my own way, I make my own decisions, and I sleep with a clear conscience every night, knowing that I am no longer part of a system that hides abuse or shuns the vulnerable. The shunning continues to be a part of my reality, as many of my former friends and family members still live within the walls of the organization. It is a quiet pain that I carry, but it no longer has the power to break me. I understand that they are victims of a system that forces them to choose between their loved ones and their salvation. I don't feel anger toward them, I feel a profound pity. They are missing out on the beauty of a real relationship for the sake of an illusion. I have learned to let go of the people who only love the mask I wore, and to cherish the people who love the soul underneath. My chosen family in Rio is smaller than the congregation I left, but the bonds are infinitely stronger because they are voluntary. I am surrounded by people who would never dream of turning their backs on me over a difference in belief. My health, both mental and physical, has improved dramatically since leaving. The chronic stress of the double life and the constant guilt had taken a toll on my body that I didn't even realize until the pressure was removed. In the humid, salty air of Rio, I have found a new rhythm of life that includes rest, reflection, and self-care. I no longer feel the need to run until I drop for a report card. I have learned that spirituality can be found in a quiet walk, a piece of music, or a deep conversation, rather than a 5-hour meeting. I am learning to listen to my body and my intuition, the very things the organization taught me to distrust. I am healing the religious trauma syndrome, one day at a time, and every day I feel a little more whole, a little more grounded, and a little more at peace. If their love was conditional upon our silence and obedience. Here, we are building something entirely different, a community based on authentic identification and mutual mental support. This is a safe haven where you don't have to explain your trauma because we have lived it. Whether you are still a PMO, navigating the complexities of family, or you are already out and facing the cold reality of shunning, our community is here to remind you of your worth. We offer the psychological and emotional support that was always denied to us, fostering a space where critical thinking is celebrated and where your mental health is finally a priority. You are not a statistic or a report. You are a survivor, and you belong here. Finally, I want to talk to you about the book I have written, which you can find through the link in the description. This book is more than just a collection of pages. It is a specialized toolkit for your recovery. When I was waking up, I searched for a guide that understood the specific terminology, the deep-seated guilt, and the unique psychological hurdles of an XJW, and that is exactly what I have created for you. It goes deeper into the steps of deconstruction and offers practical advice on how to rebuild your life, your finances, and your self-esteem from the ground up. By acquiring this book, you are not only investing in your own healing, but you are also supporting the continuity of this project, allowing us to keep creating content that reaches those still trapped in the Kingdom Hall. It is an invitation to dive deeper into your own freedom. Thank you for trusting me with your time, and for being part of this marvelous city of freedom we are building together. Remember, the road ahead may be challenging, but the destination, a life of absolute, unashamed honesty, is worth every single step. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, join our community, and check out the book to help guide your transition. You have the power to write a new chapter for your life, one where you are the protagonist and your heart is the guide. I am right here with you, every step of the way. Stay strong, stay curious, and above all, stay free. I'll see you in our next conversation. Your awakening is the greatest gift you can give to yourself and the world. The truth didn't set us free, but our courage to leave it did. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story of liberation. Join our support community today by clicking the link in the description, and don't forget to get your copy of my book to start your deep healing process. Together, we are turning the page on the past and embracing a future without fear. See you in the community. If I could go back to that day I was baptized in the assembly hall near Rio, I wouldn't tell that girl to run. I would tell her to be patient. I would tell her that she is stronger than she knows, and that her journey will eventually lead her to a place of incredible freedom. Every struggle I faced, the depression, the marital strain, the death of my mother, was a step toward my awakening. I am grateful for the pandemic, for giving me the silence I needed to hear my own heart. I am grateful for the internet, for giving me the information I needed to see the truth. And I am grateful for the XJW community for giving me the courage to walk through the fire. I am a survivor, and my story is a testament to the fact that it is never too late to reclaim your life and start over. As I conclude this chapter of my story, I want to leave you with a message of absolute hope. You may feel like you are at the end of your rope, but you are actually at the beginning of your life. The organization may take your family, your friends, and your past, but they can never take your future unless you let them. You have a voice, you have a mind, and you have the right to be happy on your own terms. I am Heloísa, a former witness, a former pioneer, and a former elder's wife from Rio de Janeiro. But today, I am simply a woman who is proud of who she is. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for being part of this journey with me. Our paths may be difficult, but the destination, a life of true, authentic freedom, is worth every single tear. I'll see you in the next story, where we continue to wake up together. My journey from the Kingdom Hall to freedom wasn't a loss of faith, it was a gain of reality. I didn't lose the truth, I finally found it within myself. Thank you for being part of this emotional journey with me today. If you found a piece of your own story in mine, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who might be searching for the light. As I stand here today, looking out over the vast, sparkling horizon of Rio de Janeiro, I realize that my story hasn't just been about leaving a religion, it has been about the profound act of waking up to my own existence. For 40 years, I lived in a state of spiritual hibernation, moving through the motions of the pioneer life while my true self slept under layers of indoctrination. The pandemic was the alarm clock I didn't know I needed, breaking the hypnotic rhythm of the hamster wheel and forcing me to confront the silence. In that silence, I found the strength to ask the questions that the governing body forbids. I discovered that the world wasn't a dark place waiting for destruction, but a classroom waiting for me to learn its lessons. Every fear I had about Armageddon or Satan's world has dissolved, replaced by a deep, grounded peace that comes from knowing the truth, not the truth I was sold, but the objective truth of my own experience and history. I am no longer a passenger in someone else's vehicle. I am finally the navigator of my own soul. The process of deconstruction was painful, like breaking a bone so it could finally heal straight, but it was the most honest work I have ever done. I had to look at the blood issue, the shunning of the vulnerable, and the failed prophecies of 1914 and 1975 with wide-open eyes. I realized that the organization I served so faithfully was a corporate structure built on the fear of its members. But as I dismantled those walls in my mind, I found a version of Heloísa that was resilient, curious, and incredibly brave. I discovered that my double life was actually my intuition trying to save me from a system that wanted to erase me. Now, I live with a singular heart and a clear mind. I don't have to hide my books, my thoughts, or my doubts. I have traded the narrow security of the Kingdom Hall for the limitless freedom of the real world. I have learned that it is okay to be human, to be imperfect, and to not have all the answers. My life in Rio is now defined by authenticity. I have replaced conditional love with bonds that are forged in the fires of reality. I have seen that the worldly people are capable of a kindness that is far deeper than anything I found in the congregation because it is given freely, without the threat of a judicial committee. My relationship with my son is my greatest victory. I have given him a life where his worth is inherent, not earned through reports or service hours. We are building a legacy of freedom, breaking the chain of religious trauma that started when I was 5 years old. As I conclude this narrative, I want you to know that your journey is also valid. Whether you are still a Pimo hiding in the shadows or a Pomo struggling to find your footing, you are a survivor. The new system is not a future promise, it is the life you start living the moment you choose yourself. Thank you for walking this long road with me. Your freedom is the most beautiful thing you will ever own. The finality of my departure from the organization was not an end, but a spectacular beginning. I remember the last time I walked past a witness cart in the streets of Rio, and instead of feeling guilt or fear, I felt a profound sense of compassion for the people standing there. They are where I was, trapped in a cycle of performing for an invisible audience, waiting for a paradise, while the beauty of their current life passes them by. I am no longer one of them, but I will never forget what it was like to be lost in that fog. My voice is now a bridge for others who are making the same crossing. I have transformed my trauma into a testimony of hope, showing that there is life, joy, and profound meaning after the truth. I am Heloísa, I am a survivor, and for the first time in my life, I am whole. The sun is setting over the mountains of Rio, but for me, the day has just begun. This reconstruction of my soul has taught me that the most sacred thing we possess is our ability to think for ourselves. The organization tries to take that away by calling it pride or independent thinking, but it is actually the essence of being alive. I have embraced my curiosity and my skepticism as tools for growth. I no longer fear apostates because I realize they are simply people who had the courage to tell the truth. I have found my own spirituality in the simple acts of living, in a shared meal, a beautiful song, or a deep conversation with a friend. I am no longer waiting for a new world to be happy. I am making my own world happy right now. This is the ultimate awakening, the realization that we are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the creators of our own meaning, and no one can take that away from us ever again. As I look at the future, I see a path that is unwritten and entirely mine. I don't know what tomorrow holds, and that is the most exciting part. I have escaped the script that was written for me by men who didn't know my name. I am learning new things every day, meeting people from all walks of life, and discovering parts of myself that I didn't even know existed. My double life has been replaced by a life of integrity, where my outside actions perfectly match my inside values. I am proud of the woman I see in the mirror. She is scarred, she is tired, but she is incredibly strong. I am a witness to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most deep-seated indoctrination. I am free. The legacy I leave behind will not be a record of field service hours, but a story of liberation. I hope that by sharing my journey, I can light a candle for someone else who is currently sitting in the darkness of the Kingdom Hall. I want you to know that the fear you feel is the fear of the unknown, but the unknown is where your life is waiting for you. Don't be afraid to ask the questions that keep you up at night. Don't be afraid to trust your own heart. The organization wants you to believe you are weak, but the fact that you are even questioning their authority proves that you are incredibly powerful. You are already waking up. In my home in Rio, the air feels different now. It feels like possibility. I have surrounded myself with books, music, and people who challenge me to grow. I have found that spirituality is not about following a set of rules, but about connecting with the mystery of existence. I am grateful for every step of my journey, even the painful ones, because they led me to this moment of absolute clarity. I am no longer a victim of my past. I am the architect of my future. I have reclaimed my name, my mind, and my life. To all my friends who are listening, please remember that the shunning only works if you believe you are unworthy of love. You are worthy. You are loved. And you have a whole community of survivors waiting to welcome you with open arms. We are the ones who crossed the bridge, and we are standing on the other side, holding a light for you. Take your time, find your courage, and know that when you are ready to walk away, we will be here to catch you. Your story is just beginning. Thank you for being a part of my awakening in Rio de Janeiro. I hope my words have brought you some comfort, some strength, and perhaps a little bit of the courage you need to find your own path. Life is waiting for you outside the walls of the organization. Go out and live it. You deserve nothing less. My journey was never about losing my faith in God, but about finding my faith in myself. I left the truth to find the truth, and I have never looked back. Thank you for finishing this journey with me today. If Heloísa's story has touched your soul, please subscribe to the channel and join our community of survivors. We are here to offer you the psychological and mental support you need as you navigate your own awakening. You are not alone, and your voice is a vital part of our collective healing. Click the link in the description to find more resources and my book, which was written to be your guide through the crossing to freedom. Until our next conversation, remember, your mind is your own, your life is your own, and you are finally free. Stay safe, stay strong, and stay curious. My dear friend, as we come to the end of this long and emotional journey together, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you from my heart to yours. Sharing the story of my life in Rio de Janeiro, the struggles, the double life, and the ultimate awakening, is not just about revisiting the past. It is about building a bridge for everyone who is currently standing where I once stood. This channel exists for one reason: to ensure that no one has to walk the path of liberation alone. When I left the organization, the silence was my greatest enemy, and I vowed that I would use my voice to break that silence for others. Your presence here, your comments, and your support are what transformed this space from a simple video into a sanctuary of truth. We are reclaiming our identities together, and every time you watch and share, you are helping to light the way for another soul searching for the exit. I also want to emphasize the vital importance of our community. In the organization, we were taught that the friends were our only family, but we quickly learned